my house right now. You washed up excuse for a man. I don't want to live with someone poor and pathetic like you. I have had enough. Do you even understand what that means? Roland has already given me everything I needed.
14 months, my lawyer told me once. That's how long it took to build the case that put his real estate empire in a hole he couldn't climb out of. He didn't recognize the name on the door until the elevator doors were already closing behind him. Nobody in that country club dining room in 2020 believed a 52-year-old man with a severance check and a dead mother's diner equipment was going to be worth $18 million by the time he shook their hands again. That was the whole point. None of them were ever supposed to see it coming. My name is Marcus Webb. I was 52 years old, the year my life fell apart in public and got rebuilt in private. I believed, for 26 years of marriage, that loyalty was something you earned by showing up every single day and never asking for credit. I was wrong about that. Loyalty isn't earned by showing up. It's revealed by who stays when showing up stops paying off. The country club was called Brookhurst Pines, out past the edge of Fairlawn. The kind of place with a dress code posted at the entrance and gravel that crunched too politely under expensive tires. Denise had picked the venue. She said it would be easier to discuss things on neutral ground. And I remember thinking neutral ground doesn't usually have a $7 valet fee. It was late October, cold enough that the groundskeepers still had the fountains running, but the flower beds had already gone brown and skeletal at the edges. I wore the only sport coat I owned that still fit right, navy, a little dated, bought for Tyler's high school graduation 9 years earlier. Denise wore something new. I could tell it was new by the way she kept glancing at her own reflection in the window behind my head instead of at my face. Roland was already seated when the host walked me to the table, which told me everything about how this lunch had been arranged before I'd agreed to it. He stood to shake my hand with the over-firm grip of a man who'd read a book about handshakes, and I noticed, the way you notice things you're not supposed to be noticing, that his cufflinks didn't match. One was a plain silver knot, the other was a slightly different plain silver knot. Close enough that most people would never look twice. Roland Pierce was a man who wanted you to see the whole outfit, and never the seams. Denise's sister Pam was there too, and 2 women I didn't recognize, friends of Denise's from the club I assume, both of them already halfway through mimosas at 11:40 in the morning. I didn't say much. I'd learned that in 24 years of plant floor supervision, back when a line went down and everyone wanted to yell about it, the man who stayed quiet was usually the only one still thinking clearly by the time the yelling stopped. Denise talked. She talked about how the divorce filing would be simple, since I didn't have much to divide anyway. She talked about how Roland had connections downtown, how the timeline could move fast if I didn't drag my feet being difficult about it. I watched her hands while she talked. She had a habit, from decades of marriage, of touching her wedding ring when she was nervous. Except there was no ring there anymore, just her thumb running circles over bare skin, like the ghost of it was still bothering her. Before we get into how this actually started, I want you to sit with something for a second. Everyone in that dining room, every single one of them, believed they already knew how this story ended. They thought they were looking at a man on his way down. Keep that picture in your head, because we're going to come back to it. Pam laughed at something Denise said. One of those laughs that's really just agreement dressed up as amusement. And one of the friends, I never did get her name, looked at me with the particular kind of pity people reserve for men. They've already decided don't matter anymore. Roland reached over at one point and squeezed Denise's shoulder, casual, proprietary. The gesture of a man marking territory he assumed was uncontested. Then Denise said it. She said it lightly, almost affectionately, like it was a joke we were all in on together. She said, "Well, it's not like Marcus is going anywhere. He's got nothing left to be broke about." And the table laughed. Not cruelly exactly, just easily. The way people laugh when they've forgotten the person they're laughing about can still hear them. I didn't argue. I picked up my water glass, and I noticed my hand wasn't shaking, and I found that more interesting than anything Denise had said in the last 20 minutes. It started 3 years before that lunch, on a Sunday afternoon that smelled like pot roast and felt, at the time, like the ordinary texture of family. Denise's mother was still alive then, and Sunday dinners at her house in Copley were a fixed point in our calendar, as reliable as the mail. That was the Sunday Roland Pierce first sat at that table, introduced as a friend of Pam's from the club, a man who did something with commercial real estate that nobody quite pinned down beyond the word portfolio. He brought a bottle of wine that cost more than my monthly car payment and made a show of not mentioning the price. He complimented Denise's mother's pot roast twice, unprompted, and offered to help clear plates, which nobody in that family had ever seen a guest do before. Family looks out for family, he said at one point, when Pam mentioned she was behind on a property tax bill. And by the following week the bill was handled, quietly, no fanfare, just a folder that appeared and then disappeared. It read at the time as generosity. I want to be honest about that. I liked him for the first several months. I liked how he made Denise laugh in a register I hadn't heard from her in years, a lighter register, like something in her had been let out of a box. The first irregularity was small enough that I almost let it go entirely. Denise mentioned, in passing, that Roland was helping her look into a modest investment account her mother had set aside for her, and Pam, something in the neighborhood of $40,000, meant to be split evenly when their mother passed. Roland had suggested consolidating it into what he called a more efficient vehicle, something with better returns. And Denise had signed paperwork she hadn't fully read, because Roland had walked her through it verbally, and it had sounded, in her words, like exactly what her mother would have wanted. I asked to see the documents. She told me I was being paranoid, that not everything had to be a negotiation, that some people could just be generous without an angle. I let it go. That was my mistake, and I want to name it plainly, because the story doesn't work if I pretend I was blameless from the start. I saw the seam in the fabric, and I told myself it was probably just a seam. The second irregularity came 8 months later. Denise's mother passed that spring, sudden, a stroke in her sleep, and in the fog of the funeral and the estate paperwork, I noticed the investment account Roland had consolidated wasn't listed anywhere in the estate documents the lawyer was working from. When I asked Denise about it, she said Roland had explained that the account structure meant it passed directly to her, and Pam outside of probate, which was convenient, she said. One less thing to deal with during grief. I asked for the account statements. She said she'd get them from Roland. 3 weeks passed. Then 5. A man who has to keep explaining why the paperwork is delayed is usually the paperwork. I didn't confront anyone. I've never believed confrontation without proof does anything except warn the other side to hide better. What I did instead that same week was call Angela. Angela Reyes had waited tables at a diner near my old plant for 11 years, a place called the Copper Kettle that my mother used to take me to as a kid, before it changed hands twice and started sliding toward closing for good. She'd started there at 23, right after a marriage that hadn't worked out and a nursing program she'd had to drop when the money ran out. And she used to say the diner had been the one place that never asked her to explain herself twice. Angela was sharp, in the way that gets overlooked in a hairnet and an apron. The kind of person who could run a Saturday morning rush for 80 cubs with 2 cooks and a busted register and never raise her voice once. I'd been eating breakfast at her counter 3 mornings a week since my layoff, partly for the coffee and partly because it was the only hour of my week that still felt like it belonged to me. I sat down at her counter that Tuesday and I told her 3 things. I told her the Copper Kettle's owner was 2 months from selling the building out from under her to a developer who wanted the lot for parking. I told her I had $11,000 left in a severance account that Denise didn't know the real balance of. And I told her that if she was willing to bet on me the way I was about to bet on her, I wanted her to start writing down quietly every single thing about how that diner actually ran, The real numbers, the real waste, the real fixes, starting that week. Angela looked at me for a long moment, the way you look at someone deciding whether they're serious or just talking. Then she reached under the counter, pulled out a spiral notebook she'd already been keeping for years out of nothing, but her own stubborn pride in the place, and slid it across to me. "I've been writing it down since 2015, she said. "Nobody ever asked to see it. That notebook is still in a drawer in my office today. We call it, half joking and half not, the original ledger." The 14 months started the morning after that conversation with Angela, though I didn't think of it as 14 months at the time. I thought of it as Tuesday, then another Tuesday, then a slow accumulation of Tuesdays that eventually added up to something with a shape. The first discovery came from the notebook itself. Angela's handwriting filled 40 pages with the kind of detail an owner never bothers to track, because an owner is busy pretending the place runs itself. She'd logged which suppliers padded their invoices by a few dollars a case, confident nobody was checking. She'd logged which shifts bled cash, because the schedule was built around favoritism instead of foot traffic. She'd logged, most usefully, that the owner, a tired man named Gil Draper, who'd inherited the place from his father and never wanted it, was 3 payments behind on the building's tax bill and hadn't told his own family. I didn't need to guess at his price. Angela's notebook told me almost exactly what number would make Gil relieved, instead of insulted. I bought the copper kettle in March, for $11,000 down, and a note I carried personally for the rest, closing at Gil's kitchen table with his wife, crying with what I eventually understood was relief, not grief. Denise didn't ask what I was doing with my time. By then we'd stopped asking each other much of anything. I told Tyler, our son, 24 that year, and estranged from me in the particular quiet way that happens when a father goes silent for too long during his own hardest year. I called him and told him I'd bought a diner. He laughed, not meanly, just surprised, and said, "With what?" And I said, "With the only thing I had left that was still mine to spend." The second discovery took longer, almost 5 months. It came from Pam, of all people, who called me one night in August, half apologetic, half drunk, asking if I knew anything about an account restructuring Roland had done with her portion of the inheritance too. She said the numbers didn't add up the way Roland had explained them, that a financial advisor friend of her boyfriend's had looked at the paperwork and used the word concerning twice. I told her carefully that I didn't know anything, which was true in the specific sense that I still didn't have documents, only a shape forming in the dark. But I told her to keep every email Roland ever sent her about it, and not to delete a single one, and not to mention to Denise that we'd spoken. The third discovery came from a woman named Carol Whitfield, a paralegal, at the firm that had handled Denise's mother's estate, who I'd met exactly once at the funeral, and who, unprompted, reached out to me that October, because something about the account transfers had been bothering her for months, and she didn't know who else to tell. She sent me copies, real copies, bank statements showing the $40,000 account had been moved, not consolidated, into a holding entity with Roland's name listed as managing member. Not fraud yet, not on paper, just the kind of arrangement that only looks legitimate until someone asks the right question in the right order. I didn't call a lawyer that week. I photographed every page, in daylight, on my kitchen table, and I filed them in a folder I kept in a safe deposit box under my mother's maiden name. Not because I was hiding anything illegal, but because I understood by then that patience only works if nobody knows patience is happening. The fourth discovery I almost didn't chase down at all, because by January I was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the diner's hours. It came through Marlene, the Copper Kettle's register operator, who mentioned one slow Tuesday afternoon that her nephew did title searches for a downtown law firm and had, months earlier, pulled a lien filing on a strip of retail property that named Roland's holding entity as the debtor, not the creditor, which struck her nephew as backwards for a man who was supposedly the one doing everyone else favors. I drove to that law firm myself on my lunch break, paid the $11 fee for a certified copy, and read it twice standing in the parking lot. It named 3 separate individual investors as junior lien holders on a property. Roland had told Denise's family was fully owned and clear. One of those investors, it turned out, was a retired schoolteacher from Stowe who'd put in her retirement savings, believing she was buying into stabilized income property. I never contacted her directly. I gave her name and the filing to Carol, who by then had quietly connected with a securities attorney, willing to look at the pattern pro bono, on the theory that where there was one retired schoolteacher, there were probably 4 or 5 more nobody had found yet. There was a fifth thing I found that spring, though I didn't understand what I was looking at until much later. Carol mentioned, almost as an aside during one of our quiet phone calls, that the securities attorney she'd brought in pro bono had pulled state licensing records on Roland's firm and found a formal complaint filed against him 9 years earlier, before he'd ever met Denise, by an elderly couple in Medina who'd accused him of steering them into an illiquid partnership they never fully understood. The complaint had been withdrawn within weeks, quietly, the way complaints get withdrawn when someone offers a settlement large enough to make the withdrawal look like a misunderstanding rather than an admission. I sat with that for a long time. It meant Denise's family hadn't been an isolated mistake in an otherwise honest career. They'd been the second act of a pattern. Roland had already rehearsed once and gotten away with clean. That changed something in me, quietly, without changing my plan at all. I'd already decided to be patient. Learning there was a first Medina couple who never got their money back just meant I understood for the first time exactly how many people were waiting on the other side of this, without knowing they were waiting on anything at all. I want to tell you about the sacrifice, because the diner didn't run on $11,000 and stubbornness alone. That same September, I sold my father's shotgun, the one he'd left me, the one thing from my childhood I'd always assumed I'd hand to Tyler someday. I sold it to a collector 2 towns over for $3,200, cash, and I used every dollar of it to replace a walk-in cooler that had been dying since Gil owned the place. I never told Tyler I'd sold it until years later. I never told Denise at all. There are debts you pay that nobody sees you paying, and I've come to believe those are the only debts that actually build something. By November, the diner was breaking even for the first time in 6 years, and Angela and I had started talking, cautiously, about a second location, not because we were dreaming big yet, but because the lunch rush was turning away regulars for lack of seats. On a Thursday night that same month, I sat alone in my car in the empty lot behind the diner, engine off, heater ticking as it cooled, and I made myself a promise I never once said out loud to another living person. I promised myself I would not raise my voice at Denise, or at Roland, or at anyone in that family. Not once. Not even when I finally had everything laid out in front of me. Anger is a poor tenant. It moves in fast, and it never pays rent, and it wrecks the place before it leaves. I decided that whatever I built, I would build it quiet, and let the numbers do the talking I'd spent a lifetime not doing for myself. Team Angela or Team Marcus, whose gut instinct do you trust more right now? Comment your pick. We're going to come back to this. That December, the Copper Kettle became, on paper, Webb's Kitchen. It was Angela's idea, the new name, and I remember she wrote it on a napkin and slid it across the counter the same way she'd slid me that notebook, like she already knew it was going to matter. Comment 1 if you think Roland already suspected something was coming that spring. Comment 2 if you think he never saw it at all. I'll tell you which one is true before we're done. Roland overplayed his hand on a Friday evening in February, at a birthday party for Pam's boyfriend, that I only attended because Tyler asked me to, wanting, I think, some proof that his parents could still occupy the same room without it curdling. Denise was there. Roland was there. Louder than usual. 3 drinks into a confidence that had been building for months on the strength of 2 real estate deals he'd closed that fall. He found me, by the drinks table, clapped me on the shoulder with the same overfirm grip from the country club, and said, loud enough for Pam and 2 of her friends to hear, that he'd heard I was still messing around with that little diner, and wasn't that sweet, and didn't I miss having something real to put my name on? Denise laughed. Not unkindly. just easily, the way people laugh when they've stopped, considering whether the joke lands somewhere it shouldn't. Then Roland leaned in, half joking, half not, and said the line I'd remember for the rest of my life. "You were never the brains of this family, Marcus. You were just the guy who showed up on time. That's not a career, that's a habit." I didn't answer him right away. I looked at his cufflinks, still slightly mismatched, still betraying a man who wanted the whole outfit noticed, and never the seams, and I understood in that moment that he'd just told me, without meaning to, exactly what he believed about himself. A man who has to remind a room he's the brains rarely trusts that he actually is. What Roland didn't know was that Tyler, standing 4 feet away getting a soda, had his phone in his pocket recording a voice memo of the whole exchange, something he'd started doing months earlier, quietly, after Pam had confided in him about the concerning paperwork, and he'd decided, on his own, without me asking him to, that somebody in this family ought to start keeping a record. He handed me the recording in the parking lot afterward, unprompted, and said, "I don't know what you're building, Dad, but I know you're building something." That was the night my son became my first real witness. Not because I recruited him, but because he'd been quietly watching the same seams I had. The reckoning happened in April, in a boardroom on the 9th floor of the building I'd bought 2 years earlier, without ever telling anyone in Denise's family that Webb's Kitchen had become Webb Hospitality Group. 26 locations across Ohio and Pennsylvania by then, with a franchise agreement pending that would take us into 11 states by the following spring. The receptionist who buzzed Roland and his team up that morning had no idea she was buzzing up my ex-wife's boyfriend, and I'd made sure of that on purpose, keeping the meeting under a generic vendor name on the calendar, because I'd learned by then that surprise only works if you protect it right up until the last possible second. Roland didn't know whose office he was walking into. That was the entire architecture of the day, built over 14 months, so that the surprise would do work that shouting never could. He'd come representing a real estate syndicate that was hemorrhaging money, the same syndicate, it turned out, that had absorbed the consolidated accounts belonging to Denise, Pam, and their late mother's estate, all folded into a portfolio of half-finished retail developments that were now underwater by several $1,000,000. Roland's business partner, a man named Corbin Yates, who'd been with him for 9 years and who I'd learned about through Carol Whitfield's documents, had arranged the meeting, pitching my company on a sale-leaseback deal for a stretch of commercial real estate they desperately needed to offload before their lenders called the loans due. Neither of them knew Webb Hospitality Group belonged to me until the conference room door opened. I watched it land on Roland's face in real time, that specific unraveling that happens when a man's mental map of the world turns out to have been wrong in a direction he never once considered checking. He recovered fast, I'll give him that, extending his hand, saying my name like we were old friends catching up. "Marcus, well, look at you." Before I could even sit down, I shook his hand. I did not raise my voice. "I want to be fair to you," he said. Maybe 20 minutes into the meeting, once it became clear his numbers weren't going to survive the questions my CFO was asking about their debt structure, I let that sit for a second before I answered. "Fair," I said, "is an interesting word for you to reach for." And then I asked, calmly, the way I used to ask questions on the plant floor when a line went down and everyone wanted someone else to be the reason, whether he could walk me through the structure of a holding entity his firm had created 6 years earlier, one that had absorbed a $40,000 inheritance account belonging to a woman named Denise Webb and her sister. The room went quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when the people in them start doing math about their own exposure. Corbin Yates, who I'd never met before that day, but whose name appeared 11 times in Carol's documents as a co-signer on the holding entity, looked at Roland with an expression I recognized instantly, because I'd worn it myself for 2 years before I understood what I was looking at. It was the look of a man realizing the person beside him had been spending his name as collateral for years without asking. I laid it out point by point, The way Angela's notebook had taught me to lay out a supply invoice discrepancy. Small and specific and impossible to argue with, because none of it was opinion. The account transfer, dated 3 years earlier. The absence of the funds from the estate paperwork, Carol had flagged. The pattern, across 4 other accounts Carol's firm had since quietly audited at my request, of Roland structuring consolidations that routed client funds into entities where he held managing control. The lien filing naming the retired school teacher from Stowe and 3 other investors as junior creditors on property Roland had represented as unencumbered. And then, last, because I'd saved it for last on purpose, the Medina complaint from 9 years earlier, the one that had been quietly withdrawn, the one that meant this wasn't a man who'd made one bad judgment call under pressure, but a man who'd found a method that worked and simply run it again on a new family, once the first one had gone quiet. Roland's face changed at that one in a way it hadn't changed at any of the others. He hadn't expected anyone to have found Medina. Nobody was supposed to have found Medina. Each fact landed harder than the one before it, not because I raised my voice, but because I didn't need to. My CFO slid across copies of the same documents I'd kept in that safety deposit box for 2 years, and I watched Roland's associate, a younger woman named Priya, who ran his compliance filings, go pale reading a page she'd apparently signed off on without knowing what it actually said. Corbin was the first to peel away. He said, quietly, almost to himself, that he'd told Roland 18 months ago they needed outside counsel to review the account structures, and Roland had told him it wasn't necessary, that he had it handled. That's the moment loyalty reveals itself as something that was never really there, when a man starts building his own exit sentence, in real time, in front of the person he's supposedly loyal to. Corbin stood up before the meeting even ended. He said he'd be in touch with his own lawyer, and he left without looking at Roland again. And that was, as far as I ever learned, the end of a 9-year partnership, undone in about 4 minutes. Priya stayed in her chair the longest, flipping back through the compliance file, like she was hoping the numbers would rearrange themselves if she looked hard enough. When she finally spoke, it wasn't to Roland. She looked at my CFO and asked, in a voice that had gone very small, whether the school teacher from Stowe had gotten any of her money back yet. My CFO told her the truth, that a claims process would open within the month once the securities filing went through. Priya nodded, closed the folder, and said she'd be cooperating fully, effective immediately, and that she wanted it on record, that she'd flagged the account structure to Roland in writing 8 months earlier and been told to let it go. She'd kept the email, of course she had. Everyone in that room, it turned out, had been keeping something. I want to give you something to sit with here for a second. Before we finish this part, there's always a moment in stories like this where people expect the winning inside to gloat. I didn't gloat. I've never believed a reckoning needs volume to be real. Denise wasn't in the room, but she found out within the hour, because Pam called her the second the meeting ended. And Denise called me that same afternoon for the first time in almost 2 years, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it, asking if it was true, all of it, the accounts, the entity. Whether Roland had really done what Carol's documents said he'd done to her mother's money. I told her yes. I told her I had the documents, and that I'd hand them to whatever lawyer she chose, no conditions, no leverage, because that money had never been mine to hold over anyone. She was quiet for a long time on the phone. Then she asked quietly how long I'd known. 14 months, I told her. She asked why I never said anything sooner. I told her the truth. Because the moment I said something, Roland would have had time to hide it better, and your mother's money would have disappeared for good, instead of coming back to you and Pam. The syndicate collapsed within the quarter. Roland's stake in it, once worth what he'd estimated at $6 million on paper, settled in a bankruptcy filing for what his own lawyer, in an unguarded moment during depositions, called a few contracts and a mailing list. Priya kept her job, eventually, after cooperating fully with the state's licensing board. And 2 years later she reached out to Carol to ask, almost shyly, whether Webb Hospitality Group ever needed compliance help for its franchise filings. I hired her myself. She's been with us 5 years now, and she still keeps a personal rule. One she told me about only once, that she reads every document twice before she signs it. Out loud if she has to, even if it slows down a closing. Corbin started his own smaller firm 8 months later. Clean, careful, chastened, and sent me a handwritten note the year we crossed 100 locations, thanking me for the meeting that had, in his words, cost him a partnership and given him back his own name. Roland moved, I heard secondhand, to Charlotte, to start over somewhere his name hadn't already been spent. I never once raised my voice through any of it. I didn't need to. The numbers had been doing the talking for 14 months before I ever said a word out loud. The porch of my house in Bath Township faces west, and most evenings that spring, I sat out there with a mug of coffee that had gone lukewarm an hour earlier because I kept forgetting to drink it while I watched the light change over the tree line. Angela sat beside me most of those evenings, by then, not because we'd made some grand declaration about it, but because somewhere in the second year of building Webb's Kitchen into something bigger than either of us had planned, we'd simply stopped imagining the porch without the other person on it. We didn't get married right away. I want to be honest about that too, because the story isn't about replacing one ring with another as fast as possible. We waited almost 2 years after the divorce, with Denise was finalized, mostly talking business at first. The two of us hunched over spreadsheets at her kitchen table long after the diners closed. And somewhere, in that stretch of ordinary Tuesdays, the conversation stopped being only about supply costs and start dates for the third location. She still keeps her own notebook, updated weekly, even now that we have a whole analytics team who could do it for her. Old habits, she says, are just promises you keep making to yourself. Tyler came back into my life slowly. The way a person comes back from a long trip, a little different than when he left, needing time to remember the shape of the room. He started working counter shifts at the flagship location that first summer. Not because he needed the money, but because he told me once, quietly, over a shift meal at 11 at night, that he wanted to understand what I'd actually built with my hands, instead of just hearing about it from a distance. He was sharp the way Angela was sharp. The kind of sharp that gets missed if you're only looking at resumes instead of watching someone actually work a Saturday rush. Within 3 years, he was running operations for the entire Eastern region. Today, he's vice president of operations for the whole company. And he still, every single year on the anniversary of that birthday party, brings me the recording on his phone, the one where Roland told me I was never the brains of the family, and we listen to it together for maybe 30 seconds. And then we turn it off and go back to whatever we were doing, not out of bitterness, just to remember where the counting started. Gil Draper, the man who sold me the copper kettle, called me out of nowhere the spring we opened our 80th location, just to say he'd read about us in a trade newsletter his wife subscribed to and hadn't been able to sleep that night for thinking about it. He told me he'd spent years assuming he'd sold his father's restaurant to a man who was going to run it into the ground within a season, the way he himself had been slowly running it into the ground without meaning to. He wanted to know if the old grill was still in the building. It was. It's still there today, in the original copper kettle location, retired from active service, bolted to a wall behind glass with a small brass plate that just says 1987, the year my mother wrote the pancake recipe on an index card. I invited Gil and his wife to the 10th anniversary dinner we threw for the flagship store, and I sat them at the best table in the house, and I made sure the check never came. I told Tyler's daughter, my granddaughter Nora, the whole story on her 7th birthday, sitting on a blanket at the park down the road from the house, the same park where I used to walk alone during the worst of that first year. She asked me why I didn't just yell at the man who was mean to me. And I thought about it for a while before I answered her, because kids deserve the real answer, not the simple one. I told her that yelling is what you do when you want someone to know you're upset right away. But waiting, and writing things down, and being patient even when it's the hardest thing in the world, that's what you do when you want to actually fix something, instead of just feeling better for a minute. She thought about that for a while, the way 7-year-olds do. chewing on it like a piece of candy. And then she asked if the diner still had the blueberry pancakes her great-grandmother used to make. It did. It still does on every menu, in all 412 locations, listed exactly as my mother wrote the recipe on an index card in 1987. Because some things are worth keeping exactly as they were, even while everything else around them changes. There's a woman named Marlene who worked the register at the original Copper Kettle location, back when Gil still owned it, 61 years old, arthritis creeping into her hands, who Gil had quietly planned to let go before the sale because he couldn't afford full staff anymore. Angela had flagged her in that first notebook, back before any of this had a name, as the best register operator either of us had ever seen, fast and warm, and never once short at closing in 11 years. When we restructured the flagship location that first year, I made sure Marlene got back pay for 4 months. Gil had shorted her during his last bad stretch. Money that never should have been owed to begin with. And I bumped her into a shift lead role with a raise that had nothing to do with pity, and everything to do with what she'd actually earned. It cost the company almost nothing. It was, I think, one of the only decisions in this entire story I never had to think twice about. Marlene still works the counter 3 mornings a week, by choice, long past any need to, because she says a good rush still feels like music to her, and I understand that completely. Because I feel the same way every time I walk past the original grill behind its little pane of glass. I never met the elderly couple from Medina, the ones from 9 years before Denise's family. The first act of Roland's pattern that I only learned about by accident. But Carol found them, eventually, through the securities attorney's filing. An old man named Everett and his wife Doris, both in their 80s by then, still living in the same modest house. Roland had once tried to leverage into a partnership they never understood. I paid for a private mediator out of my own pocket, not the company's, to help them pursue a claim against what remained of Roland's estate in the bankruptcy proceedings. And I never told them where the referral had come from. Carol told me, months later, that Everett had cried on the phone when the settlement finally came through. Not because of the amount, which was modest, but because somebody, after 9 years, had finally believed him. I think about that phone call more than I think about the boardroom. The boardroom was for me. Everett's phone call was for somebody who'd been waiting a lot longer than I had. I still carry my father's old pocket watch, the one that survived even after I sold his shotgun, to keep a walk-in cooler running that first winter. It doesn't keep good time anymore, loses about 4 minutes a day, but I wind it every morning anyway, sitting at the same counter where Angela first slid me her notebook. Because some objects aren't about function, they're about remembering what it cost to get here, and choosing, every single morning, to remember it on purpose instead of by accident. I want to say something directly to you now, because the story's basically told, and there's one thing in it I think matters more than the money or the diner, or even Roland's face in that boardroom. I've told this story more times than I can count by now, to reporters, to franchise partners, to my own grandchildren. And the part people always want to skip past is the boring part, the 14 months where nothing dramatic happened at all, just Tuesdays, just a notebook, just quiet. That's the part I'd ask you to actually sit with, because it's the part that did all the work. Patience is not the same thing as weakness. I know it feels that way in the moment. I know it felt that way to me, sitting alone in a parked car behind a diner I could barely afford, listening to people I loved laugh at the idea that I had nothing left to offer. But there's a difference between a man who stays quiet because he has nothing to say, and a man who stays quiet because he's still, gathering the words that will actually matter. Learn to tell those two silences apart in your own life, because I promise you they feel almost identical from the inside, and only one of them is building something. Here's the small thing I'd ask you to actually do, not just nod along to. Get an index card, just one. Write down the one thing right now that you know is true but haven't said out loud yet. The one number, the one document, the one quiet fact you're sitting on, because saying it too early would only let someone else hide it better. Don't act on it today. Just write it down. and put it somewhere you'll see it tomorrow morning with your coffee, and let it remind you that patience with a pen in your hand is not the same thing as doing nothing. I kept a notebook. Angela kept a notebook before I ever asked her to. My son kept a recording nobody told him to make. None of us were the loudest people in any room we walked into that year. We were just the ones still writing things down after everyone else had stopped paying attention. That's really what this story is about. If you strip away the diner and the boardroom and the 412 locations, it's about the fact that the people who count out the longest are usually the ones everybody stopped counting on first.